So he'll be our speaker in February. And so I want to thank Wes LeFlore for saying yes instead of I don't have time. I really appreciate that. His wife, Kendall, and their 4 children are here tonight. I want to welcome them and thank you all. Wes grew up in the heart of the Choctaw Nation. He has a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma Wesleyan, and a bachelor's and a master's from Northeastern and Tahlequah. And he took several Native American studies because he was interested in his own family history and in the history. He's researched his family too. He said he wanted to find out if the stories he heard were true. And as all of us who've done any family research knows, that's kind of hard to do, to verify or debunk legends. So tonight I want to welcome Wes and thank him for coming. Thank you, Wes.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to see everyone out tonight. Let me make sure, adjust that for sound so I don't.
I gotta go back.
Well, my name, as she said, my name is John Wesley LeFlore, and the only reason I bring any attention to that is that it will be significant for the presentation. I've lived here in Wellington for the last year and a half with my wife, Kendall, my 4 children, they're back there in the back. We'll have another son that'll be born in March, early March, so I'll have 5 total. And I'm not used to this. Just give me just a second to take a deep breath and soak it in. I'm a preacher, here in town, and what I'm used to doing is something different, so I have to remind myself, hey, you're not preaching, you're giving a presentation, so don't worry. I will give an invitation at the end, though. So. And like I said, my first and middle name are just as significant in the presentation as my last, but I'll get to that here in a little while. I'm still paying off my college student loans, so it probably wasn't one of the best decisions I ever made to take Native American Studies courses when I was in college. They didn't pertain to my major, but when I found out that the professor at Northeastern State University who taught the Native American Studies courses was a Choctaw historian, I couldn't resist taking those. What was a little ironic about that is she's a Choctaw historian, and she was teaching at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and she was teaching in a seminary, a building called Seminary Hall that used to be an all ladies Choctaw or Cherokee seminary, and so that's where we took the classes. Is there anyone else in the room here tonight who has Choctaw heritage? Anyone else? Let's see, one back there. My family could raise, my kids. I say, I'm going to see if my kids raise their hand or not. Not doing a very good job, I guess, tell them about their heritage. She was a really neat lady, and the lady and she taught me so much about so many things about the Choctaw Nation that I didn't learn growing up. See, the Choctaw culture it's one of those sad things about cultures like the Choctaws is the majority of the history, it's an oral history, so it's passed on generation to generation. The bad thing about that is when you have people that don't pass that on, then you lose, and you just lose so much knowledge. But she opened my eyes to the amount of artists that are in the Choctaw Nation, the amount of authors and the amount of literature. We studied we studied a lot of literature as well. And she just taught me a lot, so I just wanted to bring just a little bit of attention to that. So let's go back to the very, very beginning. As far back as history knows, there were 2 brothers named Choctaw, which is how Choctaw Indians would say Choctaw. They said Choctaw, and Chickasaw. Now, Choctaw and Chickasaw were brothers, and they were from somewhere. They originated from somewhere north and east of what's currently Mississippi. We don't know how much further north and east of current-day Mississippi they were from, but they traveled to what is current-day northern Mississippi some many years ago. We don't know the dates on that, and settled there. Their family settled there. Well, sometime along the way, they had some kind of a falling out, and they settled in the northern, and Choctaws settled in the northern part of Mississippi. Chickasaw settled in the southern part of Mississippi. Chickasaw his family became what is today the Chickasaw Nation, and Choctaw became the Choctaw Nation. So the Chickasaws and the Choctaws are truly one tribe. And that's one thing that if you are around any Native American scholars, they all basically agree that if you just go back far enough, and this could be true of all of us, you just go back far enough, we're all one tribe. So we all are mixed together. But it's interesting that those brothers who even Indian Native American culture sees as two separate tribes were brothers. They came from the same family. Fast forward a little bit to some known history and dates that we know, to the Choctaw Chief Pushmataha. He was born around what is currently Macon, Mississippi in 1764. He was known as the Indian General because he was a brigadier general in the United States, for the United States forces. He fought in several battles. Two of the most well-known ones was he fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812, and he also fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. The great irony behind that is that Andrew Jackson hated Native Americans. He used them because he needed to, and he used them because he was a shrewd man, but he did not like Native Americans. And I won't go into all the history of that. It's just a little bit of an irony there. Another great irony is when you're looking through Choctaw history, there are so many Choctaws that named their children after Andrew Jackson. Several people, even in my own family, with names like Andrew Jackson LeFlore, and which I think is just interesting. Switch to, so there's that side. There's the Pushmataha side, and just keep that in your mind just for a second. Now let's switch over to some French immigrants that traveled from France and settled across the sea in the new land in southern Florida. Good place to settle. These French immigrants had two sons, Louis LeFlore and his brother Michael LeFlore, which probably wasn't pronounced Michael, probably more like Michelle. But Louis LeFlore was a trader who traveled mainly up and down the Mississippi River, but also ventured as far as to Canada as well. And he was more a fur trader among many other things, and made relationships with all of the Native Americans up and down the Mississippi River. Louis LeFlore married 3 women. He married twin sisters named Rebecca and Nancy Cravat, which I thought, man, how on earth did that guy live? And that was in 1790. That's significant because these twin sisters were the daughters of Choctaw Chief Pushmataha. Well, if you do a little bit of research into Choctaw Chief Pushmataha, you'll find out that they were not his daughters. They were not his biological daughters. They were his adopted daughters. And I'll talk about more about that in a minute. He had his other wife was Choctaw, and her name was Hoki. Unusual name. But so we have a lot of variation in the LeFlores. With those 3 wives, he had, most historical accounts say 15 children. Some say 16, but we can't figure out who that 16th person is. Rebecca and Nancy were actually the daughters of another Frenchman named John Cravat, and an unknown woman of a tribe called the Chocahuma tribe. And you say, like, well, who on earth are the Chocahuma Indians? Well, they were a tribe of Indians that was completely annihilated by the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians. They were the Native Americans in Mississippi that were living in Mississippi when the Choctaw and the Chickasaw arrived. So we have a whole lot of people running other people off other people's land in the history of our nation. What he did is, and there's no reason giving historically for this, but what Choctaw Chief Pushmataw did is adopted these mixed race twin daughters of John Pravat and an unknown Indian lady. Louis LeFlore, let me see here, and his 3 wives and all those children lived in an area in Mississippi which is called today, and I think it was called then, I think they probably named it then, but it's called LeFlore's Bluff. Now, it used to be its own kind of area. Now it's a state park area. It's called the LeFlore Bluff State Park, and it's it exists now on the northeast side of Jackson, Mississippi. And it's just a real pretty area with the lake and pine trees and things like that. But that's where all the children were born. But the child of those children that were born, the one that we'll look at tonight, is the one that I'm descended from, who became a chief of the Choctaw Nation, whose name was Greenwood LeFlore. So you might think, when you hear me talking about my chief grandfather all those generations back, why am I so white, right? That's a question I have a lot growing up in the Choctaw Nation. Well, I'm so white because my Choctaw Chief grandfather, all those generations back, Greenwood LeFlore, was only 1/4 Native American. And if you're paying attention, he was adopted, his mother was adopted into the Choctaw Nation. She came from a different tribe. Still counted Choctaw nonetheless. But I guess technically, I am part of the Choctaw Nation. Actually, I am part of the nation that doesn't exist anymore, the Chocahuma Nation. Just a little side note there. Many of the LeFlores were a quarter blood, but many other LeFlores were half blood. But then we have this other thing in history where many LeFlores are black. Because you can figure that out. I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Greenwood LeFlore is famous as a Choctaw chief, most famous as a Choctaw chief, for signing the very first Indian removal treaty. Now, he gets a lot of bad press for that, for signing it was called the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. But if you go back, starting in 1820 and 1825 and 1828, there were several other treaties that were signed, which signed over land from the from the Choctaw Nation to the United States, mainly through trickery on behalf of the United States. This treaty was different because this treaty said that the Indians actually had to leave their homeland and go to a different land. So today, if you travel there, it's LeFlore County, Mississippi. And if you draw a line straight from where LeFlore County, Mississippi is, straight through the bottom half of Arkansas, into the southeast corner of Oklahoma, you arrive, as soon as you cross the border, in LeFlore County, Oklahoma, where I grew up, which is full of LeFlores today. Lots of places called Greenwood, there's towns, both in Mississippi, all through Arkansas, all through southeast Oklahoma, towns that are called LeFlore, towns that are called Greenwood, and counties and towns and state parks and all kinds of things like that as well. So the name is everywhere there. Just in case you're wondering, I received no land or benefit from any of that. It's something that's probably the most common question. So does that mean that it means I got nothing? I got the name LeFlore. Is what I came out with. Before signing the treaty, Greenwood didn't like the treaty, and he was the reason why he rose to prominence in his own family and became a Choctaw Chief is because he was very intelligent. He embraced European culture. He was very highly educated, and upon reading the treaty, he said, "I don't really care for this, the way that it's written." So he traveled to the capital and to speak to someone. I'm sure he didn't speak to the president himself, but he traveled to the Capitol to talk about the treaty, and was successfully able to have an amendment added to the treaty. It's famously known as Article 14. And what that article said was that anyone who didn't want to make the journey across Arkansas into Oklahoma to the new Choctaw Nation there could stay in Mississippi. They would be given a very small piece of land, that's unspecified the amount, and they would also, and upon staying, they would receive a little piece of land, and then they would become United States citizens. So there's actually two Choctaw nations, two separate Choctaw nations today. Now they're friendly with one another, but not overly friendly with one another. There's the Choctaw Nation, and they have their own separate government and constitution and everything that is in Mississippi, and then there's the bigger one, which is in southeast Oklahoma, which covers about 5 or 6 counties in southeast Oklahoma today. Not surprisingly, the government did not follow through with the promise of that land, so the Choctaws that stayed in Mississippi eventually left as well. Now, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed in 1830, and the first removal of the Choctaws began in 1831. But then a year later, there was a second wave, and then a year later, there was a third wave. And basically, the people that figured out that they didn't get what they signed up for eventually all made the trek. Now, it just so happens in 1831, in that very first wave of Choctaws that left, one of the most severe winters that has ever hit the southern United States came across the southern United States that year. The Mississippi River was frozen solid across in that year, one of the things on record. And because of the extremely harsh conditions and not being prepared for those conditions, many of the Choctaws, thousands upon thousands, died. Mainly youth and the elderly. So there was a lot of heritage lost from losing the elderly, a lot of knowledge, a lot of culture that was lost. And then there was a whole rebuilding of a nation that had to occur from losing so many of the youth as well. It was a really, really tragic thing. I said, a lot of times people think in history that the Trail of Tears started with the Cherokees. It's one of the things the Cherokees are most known and famous for. But in actuality, the Choctaws are who started the Trail of Tears. Now, I don't think that that's a real significant thing. It was a terrible thing, no matter how you slice it, and there were many others involved as well. But it always gets attributed to, the Trail of Tears always gets attributed to the Cherokees, but there were many more involved, and the Choctaws were the very first to sign a removal act, the very first to be forced out of their homeland. The treaty wasn't just signed by Greenwood LeFlore. There were several chiefs of the Choctaw Nation. There wasn't just one chief, there were many. And they all signed it, but he was the one that convinced all the others to sign as well. So today, if you talk to Choctaws, either in Mississippi or in LeFlore County, Oklahoma, and you say the name Greenwood LeFlore, there's a very mixed reaction. You know, some people think like, oh, Greenwood LeFlore, he's the chief who saved the Choctaw Nation from annihilation. Because basically they were signing a contract with a gun to their head. You know, that they didn't have a choice. You know, here's Andrew Jackson, who is now president, with the full force of the United States Army, which did not bother him to use it all. Actually, when Andrew Jackson first presented to the Supreme Court that he was going to move Native Americans to Oklahoma, they told him he couldn't do it. And Andrew Jackson's basic response was, well, I control the Army, so there's nothing you can do about it. Um, so it wasn't anything that he could really do anything about. Of course, you can see the side that I sympathize with. I sympathize with the side that says, you know, that there's nothing you can do about it. But there's many Choctaws today who said, no, there was something he could have done. He had a different choice. He could have fought. Well, to me, that just doesn't seem realistic. But I'll leave that one alone. I'll leave that argument alone. When that treaty was signed, 11 million acres of current Mississippi and also western Alabama became part of the United States. Chief Greenwood did not move to Oklahoma. He stayed in Mississippi, where he ran for office and was elected to both the House and the Senate in his time there. He had a very large and really pretty fabulous mansion there, and which not very many years ago burned to the ground, which was a terrible thing because had been turned into a museum and had a lot of neat things in it. But it is no longer there to be seen. He and many other Choctaws became cotton plantation owners. And here's what happens when you dig around in your history. You find out things like this, that many of my ancestors were slave owners. The irony of this is that many Choctaws prior to this were sold as slaves as well. Many Choctaws were sold as slaves to England and European nations, where they were taken and basically paraded around kind of like in a circus type atmosphere of, hey, look at these people that you've never seen before. After the Civil War, the former LeFlore slaves took the name LeFlore. And so today, all over Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi are LeFlores who are descendants of those slaves. Now, I used to be on Facebook, but I've since repented of that. I'm just kidding, those of you who don't like Facebook. But I'm not on there anymore, so don't try to look me up. But when I first got a Facebook account, there were lots of people whose last name was LeFlore that contacted me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. And almost every single one of the LeFlores that sent me a friend request were black. And they would send me questions when they sent me a friend request as well. They would say, are you from the LeFlores that came from northern Mississippi? And I'd say, yes, I am. And they'd say, we are too. You know, I ran people that were tracking down their family, and they'd say things like, we're long-lost cousins. And then I would think to myself, I wonder if they've thought through the implication of what that means. But that's not a part of my history, my family history that I was taught growing up, which I don't agree with. I don't agree with hiding anything from your past or from your family's history. It's all relevant. After the Civil War, there were lots of Christian missionaries who moved into the Choctaw lands from Mississippi through Arkansas into Oklahoma, and they set up schools. The motto of these schools were, kill the Indian, save the man. And which basically they had an agenda of destroying the Choctaw culture. Which actually I think is an absolutely terrible thing. I think back, and I'm not going to preach to you tonight, I promise. So when I make biblical references, I promise I'm not trying to preach to you tonight. But when Jesus spoke to a multitude of cultures, and he never had an agenda of changing a culture unless it was a sinful aspect of that culture, but the actual cultural part of it, that what made those people who they were, Jesus didn't go in to change that. So I don't agree with that. I think the missionaries would have understood that a little better than what they did. Just a little criticism there. But if you look at my family history, and the reason I said that my full name of John Wesley LeFlore is significant, that's not, it's significant because if you look through my ancestry, you will see that there are many people in my in my ancestry whose names are also John Wesley LeFlore. Well, how did that come to be? Well, that came to be because there were a lot of Methodist missionaries in southeast Oklahoma. And as those Methodist missionaries came in and had several converts, people started naming their children after the most famous of Methodists, John Wesley himself. And that the most recent of the John Wesleys prior to myself was my great-grandpa, and my dad named me after him. But going back through the history, there are many John Wesleys, and if there's a particular cemetery in southeast Oklahoma where I grew up, where there are 3 John Wesley LeFlores in the cemetery, and I used to walk through there, and I would see my name on a tombstone, and I'd walk a little further, and I'd see my name again, and I'd walk a little further to where the oldest part of the cemetery was at the back, and there would be my name again, and I just thought that was kind of an unusual feeling as a kid. But my grandpa, you know, he was very proud of all that, you know, of our history always, and he's the one that really always pushed me. He would be absolutely delighted to know that I was here speaking about this tonight, because it was one of his passions, was to learn about the history of our family. So much so, when I was 12 years old, my grandpa took me on a trip to Mississippi to explore the homelands of where our people came from. And of course, that's wasted on a 12-year-old, let me just tell you. If there's anyone out here who has a similar idea for what to do with your 12-year-old, if you have one, they would rather go to Six Flags or a water park or something like that. I say all that to say I did not appreciate it then. I wanted to do something fun. And there were some aspects of it that were fun. The things I enjoyed the most were I did enjoy the museums. There was lots of really neat things to see in there. Every single thing that we went to and saw had our name on it, which I thought was pretty neat as a kid. There were cemeteries that my grandpa read about, and bless his heart, you know, when we did all this traveling, this was way before internet days. So he had to, I don't even know how he did his research and learned about these things, but he would learn about cemeteries that were in very obscure places in Arkansas and Mississippi. And so what we would do is we would pull over and park on the side of the road, and Grandpa would have like a topographical map, and he'd say, there's a cemetery in these woods. And I'd look at those woods and I'd think like, okay, like what? So we were going into those woods. We were going to find that cemetery. So we spent a lot of time doing things like walking out in the middle of nowhere, which I did love that, and looking for cemeteries. When we would find them, when we'd find those cemeteries, there would never be a name on a tombstone, though. We'd find them in very obscure places. They were very obviously cemeteries, but there were no names on the markers. You could tell on some of them, on the best ones, where there used to be a name scribbled on there or chiseled on there somehow, but they weren't there anymore. But anyway, Grandpa was absolutely delighted when we found those cemeteries in the middle of nowhere. We also went all through Mississippi, and you can go there today, and Mississippi tourism has really kicked this thing up where you can go on what's called a mound tour of Mississippi. Well, the Choctaws like to build giant burial mounds, and there are literally hundreds of those burial mounds throughout, from the top to bottom of the state of Mississippi. The majority all being on the eastern side as soon as you cross into the state, but they like I said, there were literally hundreds of those, and we would go out to those, and all the better ones and bigger ones, nicer ones, have stairs built into them as well, where you can actually walk up the side of the mound to the very top and see that. And there used to be great palaces way back, built on top of those mounds that aren't there anymore. There are lots and lots of mounds out there that are very slowly still being investigated and excavated. Now, it's a fine line that they try to walk for obvious reasons of digging up people, and things like that. So, but there's still a major topic of study in that part of the world. So that's what we did. Other things that we did was my grandpa used to take me to powwows in southeast Oklahoma when I was growing up, which are really neat to go to if you've never gone to an Indian powwow. And if you're not an Indian and you think like, well, I don't know if I feel comfortable going there or not, you don't have to worry about that. There's just as many white people there and black people there and Hispanic people there as anybody else, so you're not going to be like the only white person that walks into the powwow. Most people go there to eat the food. It's kind of like going to a big celebration or a fair. It's just a real fun thing to go to, and you get to watch a stickball match and things like that. I won't talk about stickball. It's a neat thing too. But he would take me to powwows. Grandpa always wanted to talk to the chief of the Choctaw Nation, and Grandpa would always, talk to the chief for as long as he could hold the chief's attention, which was usually a long time. Of course, when Grandpa told him what his name was, they had automatic recognition, and Grandpa would just start talking history with these guys. And I was just kind of standing there to the side, but I've got a lot of pictures of myself, like when I was a teenager, with me and my grandpa and the chief of the Choctaw Nation, who then was a guy named Gregory E. Pyle, who was a guy who did a lot of great things for the Choctaw people. And they were in like local newspapers back home, like Generations of Choctaw Chiefs and things like that. And my grandpa absolutely loved that. He thought that was the coolest thing ever. And he would always tell me, he's like, son, you're a descendant of chiefs. You're a chief. So I always thought that was a kind of a neat thing. Like I said, most of that was lost on me as a teenager, though. There were other neat family history that came out of that as well. I also have a famous relative who was a United States Deputy Marshal who worked for Isaac Parker, who was the hanging judge. If you've seen the movie True Grit, it's kind of the outlaws would retreat into what's now Oklahoma, but then was Indian territory. And my part Choctaw ancestor, Felix LeFlore, he was United States Deputy Marshal in Indian Territory. That was where he specialized, working where he grew up. So he was a little bit of a controversial figure too, because his people kind of thought that he was, working for the man, so to speak, and working for the hanging judge, and going into territory where normally people could hide out pretty easily, but he could fish them out in that territory because he knew it and it's where he was from. But he was a neat character as well. I had many Choctaw friends, and this was a thing that came up all the time too, of different blood quantums. Now, blood quantum you will only hear referred to when you hear people talk about Native Americans. It doesn't matter what race you are or where you come from in the world. Only if you are a Native American do you have to prove that you are a Native American, and do you have to prove and have evidence of your blood quantum, meaning the amount of Indian that you are. It's kind of the government's way of thinking, well, eventually, if we keep track of this blood quantum thing, and as long as the Choctaws don't continue just to marry Choctaws, then eventually there won't be any Choctaws, because we'll blood quantum them out. Now, I am 1/32nd Choctaw. I'm recognized as a member of the Choctaw Nation, what we call back home a card-carrying member. I have the card that proves my identification. My children are also card-carrying Choctaws, but their children will not be recognized as being Choctaw because the blood quantum cuts off at 1/64th. So I think that's a tragic thing as well. It's a way to get rid of a culture of people, is what it is. Growing up, I had a lot of friends that were Choctaw of all different amounts of Choctaw blood, and it was a very common question. growing up to say, for people to say to you, how much Indian are you? A very common question when I was in school. People would ask you that all the time. And that's really all that seemed like that was the main issue. That's mainly what people cared about. Sadly, I think most Choctaws didn't know anything about their history, not the ones that I knew. And when I'm talking about Choctaws here too, I'm talking like full-blood Choctaw Indians, or they say full-blood. We don't know. We can't trace that well enough to know that, but they certainly looked like they were full-blood. My best friend, for instance, growing up, he was 3/4 Choctaw. His dad was full-blood. And when I'd ask his dad questions about the Choctaws and things like, there were things that my grandpa had told me, and he was completely oblivious to these things. He just didn't know them. He would just say things to me every once in a while in a mockingly Indian voice, things like, he'd be eating a giant plate of food at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I'd say, Benji, why are you eating that giant plate of food at 10 o'clock? And he would say, Wes, white man eats by clock, red man eats by hunger. So he only said things like that, just like making fun and ribbing us some. But they were, when I said, well, hey, I'm Choctaw, there was always kind of an eye roll from those Choctaws that had more Choctaw blood. It's like, well, yeah, you're one of those card carriers, but we're really the Choctaws. I mean, look at us and look at you. You're not a Choctaw, which I always thought was kind of unusual. The Choctaws did a lot for me growing up, too, though. I had free health care, growing up. I had to go to what was called the Indian Clinic, and I had free dentist visits growing up. Now, though it was free, sometimes it was questionable. In recent years, though, from what I hear, I haven't been to those clinics in years, but from what I hear, that ever since the Choctaws got into the gaming industry, the hospitals and the dentist clinics have really beefed up and are very, very nice now. So there were some pretty traumatizing experiences, especially at the dentist growing up. I'll just leave it at that. But it was free, so I'm not going to criticize. My family, because we were a very poor family, and all the poor families in the Choctaw Nation received commodities, which was like a Choctaw form of welfare. We received, the big block of cheese and these funny-looking cans of grape juice and apple juice and things like that. But we received those. Every year that I was in school, from kindergarten through 12th grade, I received free school supplies, which would be a backpack, notebooks, pencils, and everything that a kid would need for school. When I went to college, every year that I was in college, I received $1,000 per semester for every single semester I was in college from the Choctaw Nation. So I have all this information about the Choctaws and my family history and things like that. So the question I ask myself is, what do I do with all this information that I have? What good is all this information to me? Some of it's really neat information. Some of it's really disgraceful information. I wasn't jumping up and down with joy to find out that I had ancestors that were slave owners. That's not something I was excited to learn about. Here's what I do with the information. First, I allow myself to be inspired by the neat things. A lot of my ancestors were explorers. They traveled all over the land, and they wanted to see new places and new things and explore. And that's something that I love to do too. I love to explore wild places, and that's one of my favorite things to do. And that's something that I can share with my kids and be proud of. I can tell my kids, like, hey, we love to go out exploring, and we come from a long line of explorers. On the flip side, I also look at the shameful parts. Excuse me. And I make the determination that I will be nothing like that. I will leave a legacy that my descendants, 200 years from now, can do research on and look back and be proud of. All right, so I don't know how to end a talk, like I said earlier, without giving an invitation. So we'll sing all verses of Just As I Am until somebody responds. No. So what I'll do instead is just say thank you for listening. And if you have any questions whatsoever, I have way more information than what I shared. I just knew that if I didn't cut it off and make it as specific as I could, that I would run out of, that you would all fall asleep and I would run out of gas eventually. So thank you, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Yes?
When you got that $1,000 per year, do you have to go to school in Oklahoma?
No, and it was actually $1,000 per semester. So it's more,
So
yeah.
as long as you're a card carrying Choctaw, you can get $1,000 per semester?
That's what it was when I was in college. It has probably changed since then. I know I look young, and but I went to college, about 20 years ago. So I don't know what has changed since then, but I'm sure it's probably more now, I would guess. And I had to maintain, I guess I'll say this too, I had to maintain a 3.0 GPA. I had to maintain a B average to keep that. So it was an incentive to keep my grades up. Yes, ma'am.
Did your grandfather speak native language?
My grandpa, he knew a handful of Choctaw words. That's just shameful. He knew all the dirty ones. And and then I think he made some things up too. You have to know a little bit growing up in southeast Oklahoma. Like my hometown was a town called Bokoshi. There was a coal mine in town, and in its boom days, it probably had a population of a few thousand people because it had the railroad and it had a coal mine. And but then the coal mine went out because it was too dangerous and too many people died in it. And when the coal mine went out, they shut down the railroad that went through that area too, because that's the only reason the railroad was there, was to take the coal. So today it's a population of about 400. That's probably all information you don't need, but the town's still there, and it's called Bokoshi. It's a Choctaw word, or they would call it Bokoshe, and it means little creek. That's it. There's a little creek once you drive into town. There's a little bitty bridge, and you drive across the little bridge, and it's just called Little Creek. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you said you were going to tell something later. I want to ask you, do you have a brother named Charles? If not, tell me about John Wesley. I'm a Methodist.
Oh, okay, sure. I do not have a brother named Charles. I don't have a brother. I have a sister, one sister, but no, I don't.
No, I just had to tease you about John Wesley. Tell me about that.
The funny thing about that too, though, is I'm a preacher at the Church of Christ, but when I went to college for my ministry degree, I went to Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and while I was there, the professors there would say to me, they would say, "Wes, like, you go to the Church of Christ?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I do." And they say, "But your name is John Wesley." I mean, come on, guy. So they gave me a hard time too.
Well, why? Why did you get the name John Wesley?
Oh, my dad simply named me John Wesley because that was his grandpa's name, and his grandpa was his favorite person in the world. So the religious part of my family did not exist when I came around. So I'm sure that my dad didn't even know who John Wesley was. Other than his grandfather, yes.
So do you know who Wes LeFlore is?
I've heard that name, yes. I've read that.
Well, it's showing that he was a chief in the Choctaw Nation.
Yes. Yeah, there were lots of chiefs. I mean, at any one time, I mean, there were probably 15 chiefs that signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And there were many, many after that. And the Choctaw Nation is divided today. There's a Choctaw Nation, in Mississippi that has, like I said earlier, I think, has its own government and constitution and everything. Then there's the one in Oklahoma. But the Choctaw Nation's really split up severely. It split at the signing of Dancing Rabbit Creek. It split and fractured even more during the Civil War part of the Choctaw Nation fought for the North, and part of the Choctaw Nation fought for the South. So they were family against family at that point, and the nation divided up. Any other questions? Yeah.
Does the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma also have its own government?
It does. Yeah, it's a sovereign government. Though all that money they make at those casinos, they pay 0 taxes on. Yeah, that's what they're most proud of. It's funny, if you go to Southeast Oklahoma, they sell T-shirts that say like Choctaw Casinos. You know, and it'll say like on the T-shirt, taking back from the white man $1 at a time or something like that.
Yeah, you said when you were a kid that you didn't really appreciate when your grandfather would take you on these trips. Do you take your kids on any of these historical trips to point out any about their heritage?
Not yet. My children I have 2 7-year-olds, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a soon-to-be born, so not yet, no. No, they would not appreciate it, yeah. But I do plan on teaching them, absolutely. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you ever take your kids down to the Choctaw Festival on Labor Day?
I have not, and where are you referring to? Choctaw Festival, where at?
Down Tallahassee, Oklahoma?
Oh, okay. No, I have not, but that's something I do plan on taking them to things like that someday.
Well, it's got a lot of history.
Sure. I lived in Tallahassee 1 year in my life, too, growing up.
He's from Tallahassee.
Yeah. I'll talk to you afterwards. Okay, John?
In the article in the paper, it said somebody dug your grandfather up and buried him face down.
Yes. You know, when I read that, I actually didn't know that, but that would not surprise me at all, because there's so many that you know. I think the people were delusional. Truly, said like we should have made a stand. You know, it's like what kind of a stand? And truly, I mean, longbows versus the United States Army. You know, there were some people that tried that. They don't exist anymore.
Well, there's some that did, though, too. We just came from South Florida. The Seminole and the Miccosukee will tell you that they stood them off. Of course, they did that by going to land that nobody wanted.
Right, yeah.
They fought the United States Army to a standstill in Central Florida.
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson.
Right.
Standstill in Central Florida.
Yeah. Any others? Pam?
Did you get to go see your grandfather's mansion, the museum?
Got to see the remains of it.
Okay, I wondered if
Yeah.
they were.
It was out in the field, and we walked around out there, and you could tell the foundation was still there, and you could tell it was a giant mansion.
But you never got to visit it while it was a mansion?
No,
Really?
No.
See, what years was that?
I'm not for sure.
I just wondered, okay.
I think it burnt down in 1942.
Oh wow.
We weren't here.
Sure.
Wow. I guess you didn't.
Did you get to see any of your grandfather's belongings in any of the other museums, or did they all go down with the?
Oh no. There were lots of things. You know, he was. But the thing was, like all of the things from Greenwood LeFlore that are still in existence, that are like in museums and things, they all look like. I mean, they're all like European things. You know, he really embraced European culture, and that was how he adapted to survive, and you know that's part of why he kind of turning it back on a culture. You know, it's a funny thing too, because a lot of people say, well, he turned his back on his culture. He was a quarter Native American, so it's like he turned his back on a little bit of his culture, but not on all of his culture. He was a lot of cultures. So
Did he look like an Indian?
he did look like an Indian. Yeah, if you just Google, you know, Greenwood LeFlore, you can see a picture of him, and it's just one very famous painting that was painted of him. And yeah, but if you didn't know that he's a very light-skinned Native American. You can definitely tell that I think you can definitely tell that he was mixed race, and he could just as easily be Hispanic too. I think when I look at the picture, I think he looks very Hispanic in it. He also looks very European. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Oklahoma, and I remember one of the things we studied in Oklahoma history was the 5 civilized tribes, which seems like a terrible way to say it. Why did they say 5 and civilized?
Let me tell you, like I had an art teacher in the 5th grade whose name was Miss Gist, and she was a Choctaw lady, and believe me, she hated that. And when she taught us about Native American culture in her art class, she would say, "Don't you ever listen to when they say the 5 civilized tribes, because the reason they were called civilized is because they signed treaties."
Is that right?
That's why they were called civilized. All the tribes were civilized. It wasn't now history tries to paint these tribes as these really uncivilized, wild people, but they weren't. And if you look at their culture, they weren't at all. They were very distinguished cultures, and they had really neat. One other thing I was just going to mention from my culture, one of the things that disappointed me when I was growing up is when I found out that none of my Native American ancestors lived in teepees. They weren't from the type of Indians that lived in teepees. They lived in these houses called chutas, and they had 2 homes. Everyone had 2 homes. They had one that had basically a thatch roof and clay sides with thatch on the sides as well, and that was the winter home. The summer home had a roof. It basically the frame of a house with no walls for coolness. They had a very specific way that they built those, that they would say if you build them the right way, you won't have any issues with bugs. And I don't believe that at all. I do not buy that. So.
Did they create a written Choctaw language? And because that's one of the things that the so-called civilized tribes also had written languages, like the Cherokee developed a written language.
Mm-hmm.
Did they do that for Choctaw, and do they still teach Choctaw in the nation?
They do. They do that. There is a language, and yes, they do teach it still today. Like you can go to Durant, Oklahoma, which down in Oklahoma is called Durant. But you can go down there in the Choctaw Heritage Centers and things like that, which there's lots of now. You can take a course on about anything Choctaw culture, history related. For anything from language to how to weave baskets, to how to make the pots that they made, to how to make the art that they made and the weapons that they made and all that. So it's pretty neat, all the things that are available. The Choctaw Nation is the third largest nation, Native American nation in the United States, with a little over, on their count, because I have to count, a little over 200,000 members. 100,000, or somewhere around 100,000 being in Oklahoma. Or I think it was 80,000 in Oklahoma. Another very high percentage in Mississippi. Around 20,000 in California. There's a lot of Choctaws in Southern California.
They actually have a Facebook page since you're not on Facebook.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, but then there's also Choctaws in every other state because people travel. Yes?
What are the other 2 tribes?
I don't know. I was hoping somebody would not ask me that. I don't know which tribes are bigger than the Choctaw Nation. I would guess one has got to be the Cherokees, because Cherokees are all over the United States, from the Northeast all the way down to Oklahoma and further.
The Cherokee and Navajo.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the other would be.
I just find it really sad, tragic that these mighty tribes have been reduced to like only 200,000 people.
Right. And the thing is, and the great downsizing of all of the Native American tribes happened it's estimated that 90% of all American tribes, Native American tribes, were reduced by European diseases in the first years that Europeans were in the United States. I mean, it's interesting in history, you know, you read about, and believe me, when you grow up with a bunch of Native Americans and you're reading American history, they go berserk. You know, they of all the things they say, it wasn't a new undiscovered land, it was a land with millions of people living in it, you know, so.
I have the history book from the 1920s, and it's way on PC.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I mean, I would hate to be an African American or Native American kid in class where that book was taught.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Generations, would you have to go back to like the family that were pot makers and basket weavers?
Oh, they still, there are still, the professor that I had at Northeastern was a professional basket weaver, traditional Choctaw basket weaver, and she made 2 baskets per year and sold them for $10,000 a piece. And so they still exist today, and they still teach it today. But I would say to where it was in its height, 6 generations. Any other questions? All right. Hey, you've been a lovely crowd. Mine's Wes, and if you ever have any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer them, and very nice to meet you all.